Namaskar, welcome to CEC lecture. The topic for the lecture is explaining political communication. Now, in this lecture, we shall try to look at this topic through the multidisciplinary lens. Dear learners, as we all know that political leadership and communication is a very important topic, especially understood in the bigger frame of skill development, skill enhancement. And seen in that perspective, the lecture shall focus on the multidisciplinary dimension of the topic. We shall analyze critical components of communication and also look at the conceptual framework through definitions, revisiting and understanding elements, features amongst others. Now, when we talk about political communication, we all know that the world of politics, the world of public sphere has a very important component of the people. And when we talk about political communication, it is very important to decode the communication perspective in the bigger frame. And therefore, it is important to look at how and what is communication. Communication between the ruling organizations of a society and the people is very important for any polity. And in this framework, political communication analyzes the big picture, that is, looking at the interactive process concerning the transmission of information amongst politicians, new media and the public at large. So, when we look at this important introductory context that communication is very significant in any polity, political communication therefore becomes more important because it has to analyze the interactive process, looking at the transmission of information amongst the politicians, the news media, the various governmental organizations and the public at large. Now, with these important remarks, let's understand and decode the concepts. What do we mean by communication? Often asked, define communication. Communication is derived from the Latin word communis. Now, when we talk about the words communis, commune, all of them, they impact the understanding, that is affecting the whole state, the community. That is it means to make common, to transmit, to impart or to share between the two or more persons or group. Therefore, when we try to look at communication, this dimension of making things common, of transmitting, to impart or to share between two or more persons or groups is very important. And from this basic decoding of the word communication, we now understand that communication, it's a very important aspect of human life. Communication, as we talk about, it is as old as human civilization. And then let's understand that the idea of communication is developed right from the birth. So, when we talk about sharing ideas, when we talk about expressing thoughts, when we talk about sharing experiences or decoding feelings, communication is an important aspect of human life. And in this framework, dear learners, it is important to see that in the public sphere, when we decode public policies, when we look at the communications with respect to the democratic apparatus, political communication is also very significant. And to understand the multiple dimensions involved in political communications, knowing the basic elements of communication can be indeed very significant to understand the topic. Communication, as we all know, it is a very important pillar of human civilization. Human civilizations have always are always nurtured when ideas, thoughts, expressions, feelings are well decoded and communicated. Now, with this basic understanding that communication is an important aspect of human life, it is something as old as human civilization. When we talk about sharing ideas, thoughts, experiences, feelings, from therein, now let's decode some important works of authors. So, for that, in order to take the discussion forward on understanding communication, let us now look at ideas of some of the important authors in order to decode definition of communications. A very important definition by Newman and Sunner talks about that communication is an exchange of facts, ideas, opinions or emotions by two or more persons. So, herein again let us understand that how the realm of communication, the realm of exchange is so broad. Facts, ideas, opinions or emotions. So, therefore, in this definition, when we talk about facts, ideas, opinions or emotions, in the context of political communication, all this becomes again very important, dear learners, because facts, ideas, opinions, emotions, all of them are subject to revisions. With new research, new inputs come in, with new perspectives coming in, facts, ideas, opinions, emotions also undergo redefinition. So, communication, when we try to understand it as an exchange of facts, ideas, opinions or emotions by two or more persons. In this realm then, communication, especially the concept of political communication, becomes a very dynamic one. In the same vein, taking the discussion forward, communication, it is the process of passing information and understanding from one person to another. So, when we try to define or take the definition of communication as the process of passing information and understanding from one person to another, this brings into light that how the ambit of information and understanding also demands analysis. So, communication is just not then a process of passing, but also that we have to understand the two related phenomenon here, the two related processes here, information and understanding. So, therefore, when we say communication is the process of passing information and understanding from one person to another in the context of political communication, both these processes, information and understanding, also therefore needs to be factored in. Dear learners, another very important definition of communication comes from the definition provided by Peter Little. That is, communication is a process by which information is transmitted between individuals or organizations so that understanding, response results. So, again here in this definition, the focus here is not only on the process by which information is transmitted, but also that is there should be focus on the response results also. And this definition also tells us about the dynamic nature of communication, that it is not a one-way series. It is not just about process of transmitting information between individuals or organizations, but that this process of transmission of information also has a very important end also. So, therefore, one has to also focus on this end part also. So, in this we get the sense that communication is not a one-way process, and therefore, when we understand this definition, again in the framework of political communication, one has to look at what is the input and equally factor in what is the output. One has to understand the information and transmission. One also has to look at the response results. So, important to understand features that we must understand as we have just understood from the understanding of the definitions. Communication is a process. Information is transmitted between individuals and organization. Communication ensures an understanding response from the receiver of the communication. So, when we look at communication as a process, therefore, one has to look at the multiple aspects involved with respect to management of the communication. That is, what are the things that actually go in the process of communication. So, therefore, the information is transmitted, and also one must also then also has to look at what happens to the information, that is ensuring an understanding response from the receiver of the communication. Another very important perspective on communication comes from Coates and O'Donnell's work, that is, communication is an exchange of facts, ideas, opinions or emotions by two or more people. Communication, therefore, when we read Coates and O'Donnell, there is this very important sense that it is a two-way activity. That is, now what are the important inputs in this two-way activity? There is a communicator and receiver of communication. Exchange implies reception and response from the receiver to ideas, emotions, opinions of the communicator. Now, as we read from the perspective of Coates and O'Donnell, that is how communication is a two-way activity. So, even political communication has to look at that how the communicator and the receiver of communication, how these two fundamental pillars are well balanced or well synchronized with respect to ideas, emotions, opinions. And this is what makes communication as not just a two-way activity, but that a right balance between these two pillars of the two-way activity would ensure efficient, effective communication both from input as well as output. Moving forward, as we try to understand communication, Kate Davis rightly says that communication, it is the process of passing information and understanding from one person to another person. And this subjectivity, that is passing information from one person to another person, is again very significant to factor in the issues that are involved in communication. John Alcair's work points out that communication is essentially the ability of one person to make contact with another and make himself or herself understood. So, again the focus on the person factor becomes important, with not only with respect to comprehension, but also with respect to ensuring that the right message is decoded. Another very important perspective from William Newman and Charles Sommer, that is, communication is an exchange of ideas, facts, opinions or emotions of two or more persons. Louis Allen also points out that communication, it is a bridge of meaning. It involves a systematic and continuous process of telling, listening and understanding. And when we talk about political communication, this idea of telling, listening, understanding becomes again very much important to factor in, because when we are there in the public sphere, when information has to be has to be presented with respect to the matters of the policy, the continuous process of telling, listening, understanding has to be thoroughly understood. Now, when we look at that how communication has been looked upon as a process of transformation of information, attitudes or emotions from one person or group to another or another, primarily through symbols, as Theodorson talks about. So, again in the initial phase of the dawn of civilization, where as we decode political communication also, dear learners, it is very important to underline that communications too has witnessed evolution. With time, it has witnessed changes, both in terms of medium, both in terms of mechanisms, amongst others. Another very important perspective comes, or that is, communication is conceived of, that is a process of transferring feelings, motivations, ideas and knowledge from one person to another in a way in which the receiver was seen as a passive agent. So, again, as we decode even these earlier definitions of theorists, of authors, of scholars, there is the sense that how the concept of communication, how the processes of communication have witnessed change in terms of understanding and comprehension. So, therefore, when we look at features of communication, it is a complete and rational process. It is transmission of understanding from the sender to the recipient of the message. Communications, dear learners, it is a two-way process. When we talk about communications, as we try to decipher and decode from all the definitions of and works of scholars that we have understood, communications, dear learners, it is always done with a purpose. Communication requires at least two parties, sender of the message and recipient of it. Communication, dear learners, it is a circular process that starts with the sender of the message and traveling through various stages, completing itself via a feedback to communication from recipient to the sender. Further, as we try to decode communication, again this decoding, this deciphering has to be there in the bigger framework of political communication. Communication is not just merely about written or oral messages. Communication includes everything that may be used to convey the meaning from one person to another person. Communication, therefore, as rightly pointed by Fred G. Mayer, it is the act of making one's ideas and opinions known to others. Further, as we try to understand the process of communication, so from definitions we get the sense that communications, it is a continuous process. Communications involves important elements, namely sender, message, receiver, etc. So, all these processes of communications again needs to be understood then in the framework of the elements involved in the communication process. Let us decode elements involved in the communication process. First, sender. Sender generates the message. Sender conveys it to the receiver. Sender is often the source, the one who starts the communication. Further, sender, that is the person who sends the message. A sender makes use of symbols, of words or graphics or visual aids to convey the message and produce the required response. The views, the background, the approach, the skills, the competencies, the knowledge of the sender has a great impact on the message. The verbal and non-verbal symbols chosen are essential in ascertaining, in knowing the interpretation of the message by the recipient in the same terms as intended by the sender. Further, when we talk about the factors which are important for the sender, the language competency, the voice, facial expression, emotions, energy level, attitude, beliefs and values. Further, as we talk about elements involved in the communication process, the second, the message. The message is the idea, it's the information, a view, a fact, a feeling. It could be amongst any of these things. Message is generated by the sender. It has to be communicated further. Message, dear learners, it is the key idea that the sender wants to communicate. Communication, as we all know, the process begins with deciding about the message to be conveyed. So again, when we talk about factors impacting communication, what are the factors related to the message? Accuracy, precision, simplicity, clarity, appropriateness, imagination, originality, choice of medium, length of communication. Further, as we discuss elements involved in the communication process, encoding, the message generated by the sender is encoded symbolically, such as in forms of words, pictures, gestures, amongst others, before it is being conveyed. Encoding, that is, since the subject matter of communication is theoretical and intangible, its further passing requires use of certain symbols like words, actions or pictures. Conversion of subject matter into these symbols, it's the process of encoding. Elements involved in the communication process. Next is the media, that is the manner in which the encoded message is transmitted. Further, the elements involved in the communication process, decoding, the process of converting the symbols encoded by the sender after decoding the message is received by the receiver. Elements involved in the communication process. Next, dear learners, receiver, the person who is last in the chain for whom the message was sent by the sender. Recipient is a person for whom the message is intended, aimed or targeted. And again, when we try to look at factors with respect to the receiver, intelligence, learning skills, self-esteem, age, experience, beliefs, values. Decoding, as we just discussed, the person who receives the message or the symbol from the communication tries to convert the same in such a way so that its meaning is complete for understanding. And the last element, that is elements of feedback. Once the receiver confirms to the sender that he has received the message and understood it, the process of communication is complete. Feedback is the main component, dear learners, for the communication process. It helps the sender in confirming the correct interpretation of message by the decoder. So, dear learners, with all these important elements in communication, also important to refer to noise, that is the obstruction that is caused by sender, message or receiver during the process of communication. And all these important elements of communications are very significant as one takes the journey, as one tries to understand the landscape of political leadership and communication. Dear learners, we hope that this lecture presented to you important insights with respect to political leadership and communications and looking at the big framework of communications in the public sphere. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.